Welcome, one and all, to the High Performance Human Podcast. It's your man, Andy, here. And I'll be honest, right? So, Emily Heath and I have attempted to have one of these conversations previously. And I have said to Emily that there was some technical issues and recording issues, and bits of it dropped out. But if we're being honest, gang, I think I just wanted an excuse to have another chat to us. So Emily Heath is joining us on the High Performance Human Podcast. She is a behavioral neuroscientist. She's got a PhD in neuroscience. She's an executive consultant, researcher, and a financial capability specialist. Now, that makes her sound somewhat, out there from an intellectual point of view. However, when you discover through this conversation, if you haven't already encountered Emily Heath on your journey, you'll soon discover that this is a human who observes the world in a way that would be incredibly helpful should the world pay a little bit more attention to her. She's an absolute superstar, and I am delighted to have another conversation. If honestly, Emily, if I was going to have any tech fails with anyone, I'm glad it's you, to be perfectly honest. How are you today?
I'm good, thanks. I'm excited for take two of the conversation, I have to say.
Well, team, I've kept the bits that were kept via Zoom, and hopefully we'll have as good a conversation this time, because we had an amazing chat about a few different things, and the way that you'll discover Emily articulates a number of perspectives around certain challenges that society, humanity, and we're all facing in life. It's a thing I feel inspired by, and I feel enlightened by, and I do honestly, Emily, when you've done a lot of your homework, your research, your thesis, all of those, when you've been doing all your studying, before I ask you to tell everybody who you are, do you find that have you found over your trip that you've altered within yourself, where you've had like a series of aha moments that have sort of put a lot of things into greater context?
Yeah, I would say so. I definitely feel I've had those sort of moments where I've reflected on my own journey, my own opinions, my own beliefs, and then gone, oh, there's a whole new way of looking at this or thinking about it. To be really honest, sometimes it's been an aha moment. Sometimes I'm a little bit slower than that. And it's sort of, a build up of things over time. And I suddenly go, oh, okay, with this preponderance of evidence, then I've changed my mind about how I'm thinking about things. So some aha moments, some gradual evolutions as well.
Yeah, for sure. Because although your brain fires at a higher level than most, especially me, but there would therefore be, I would have thought there'd be a greater propensity for you to have a few more internal heart versus head battles, maybe.
Yeah, I would say so. I think that that I do have, I don't know if it's more heart versus head battles, but I definitely do have that. Um, Especially because, where the field I work in is behavior change and human behavior. And when you learn about how people actually make decisions, what actually drives people, what are the common mistakes that we're all vulnerable to making, really actually you do get a lot more empathy for yourself as well. And you realize, hey, there's a lot going on inside my head. There's a lot of really common mistakes that we all make. I make them too. I'm vulnerable to that too. And even, as you start to look at research into how we make decisions and you understand how much emotion is a huge driver of decision, and in fact, a very important driver of decision, it also gives me that ability to trust my heart a little bit more than I would have in the past.
Fair. Oh, I'll tell you, this conversation I'll tell you now, is definitely going in a different direction this time. That is going to be a really cool topic that we're going to have a yarn about. Before we crack on, though, with the bulk of the show, Emily Heath, if you could let everybody know a little bit of a genesis as to who you are, your bit of your background, and what got you to this point.
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned, I have a PhD in behavioral neuroscience. So I was working in a lab studying the learning and decision making and sort of the neural correlates of learning and decision making. But then post PhD decided I wanted to actually do something a bit more applied and a bit more practical. So I moved to work in behavior change consulting. So basically worked with large organizations, companies, governments to help them look at, behavioral challenges that they were facing and how we could design evidence-based programs and interventions that would really allow them to change the behavior of the people that they were working with. And the real key for that was always with a positive social outcome. So you mentioned financial capability, helping people make better financial decisions for themselves, for their future. Worked in STEM, helping young people choose STEM as a career or see themselves in the STEM world that might have been disengaged from STEM. Road safety, scams and fraud, vulnerability, mental wellness. So basically in areas where we know that changing behavior could have a really big impact on people, I try to find out what are the levers we can pull to most effectively change that behavior. And I think the key thing I've learned is the levers are often not what you think they're going to be. And so really taking the time to apply the science of behavior change to drive change.
Interesting. Interesting. What got you into this line of work? What was it? What was the little inkling that made you think, right, I want to use my power of intellect to go down this path? What was it?
So it was actually this was one of my gradual changes over time. So I was enrolled at uni. I was standing in line going to do my PhD in cancer research. I always knew I wanted to use science to help people. So I had signed up to do this research into sort of a new treatment methodology for cancer. And I'd also happened to have been accepted into University of Sydney School of Medicine at the same time. So I was going to do them together. And I really felt like I had this path ahead of me of exactly what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go. And I got a call from Don, who you've talked to. He's also my husband. He wasn't my husband at the time, saying, hey, we're starting a company. We really want you to come and work for us and help us design this company. I had no idea what it was. For whatever reason, I walked out of the line. I was literally in line to enroll, got out of line, went to work at, it was called Change Labs at the time, and then just fell in love with it and fell in love with this idea that we can use science, we can use an evidence base to really make a positive impact in people's lives through behavior. And so quit my PhD, re-enrolled to do it in behavioral neuroscience instead, because I still love the science side of things. And then just never looked back. It's been such a rewarding journey to work on this. And it's also, I think, as you said, it's a journey where I learned so much about people, about humans, but also about myself. And I feel like I can make a difference as well. So it's been awesome.
You've been making plenty of differences in plenty of people's lives. And that's why, team, take down a butt ton of notes and make sure that you tell someone about this individual, please, because she is someone that, like I mentioned at the top of the show, the world could do a lot worse than listen to Emily Heath for a lot longer, I reckon, and pay a bit more attention, that's for sure. Now, Emily, as we always have on this show, we have our little tradition where we ask all of our guests, as you have once before already, to define what their version of a high-performance human is. I've got this belief: success, connection, influence, and happiness. 4 elements that go into it, and all operate in an ecosystem where one can't survive without the other. Emily Heath, tell us, what's your version of a high-performance human?
Well, I mentioned this last time we chatted, but I often find these questions a bit challenging because behavior is so complex. So I'm like, what are just the simple things that make someone high performance? I think for me, and I'm curious if I give the same answer as last time, but I think it would be 3 things. I think that a high performance human knows what they want. They have a really clear goal. They're moving towards that goal. The second thing is that I think they have the skills, the knowledge, the ability to remove barriers or to accelerate their progress towards the goal, because we know that when we try to get things, there are a ton of things that get in our way. And I think the third thing is that the goal that they have is something worth wanting and that will actually maximize their well-being. I think that so often what winds up happening is we have a story in our heads of, I'll be happy if, it'll be so good when, and sometimes those stories aren't necessarily fully correct. And so I think a high-performance human is setting a goal for themselves that's really actually going to make a positive overall impact on their lives ongoing.
I think that's a little bit more real world. I think you've gone a little bit more practical on this one, I think, off memory. Interestingly, though, it sort of ties in with a bit of a train of thought that you might have sparked actually in me from our first conversation. Potentially, you actually could have done. That's a bit weird. Interesting. Around self-worth. So after we spoke, I had a conversation with Mel Thomas, and who is a huge advocate and voice for those that have suffered domestic violence or family violence. And she's gone through a shitload of it herself. And I asked her the question, how do you develop self-worth having gone through the drama and the issues and the indignity of what she's gone through, where effectively all of that shit would have understandably made anyone feel worth less or have an existence that isn't relevant to themselves when someone that they supposedly love does what they do to them, right? Now, it's then got me going down a bit of a train of thought around this whole topic of worth, right? You said and you said at the bottom of yours, know what they want, have the knowledge to do it, and understand that it's worth wanting. How do you know if something's worth wanting?
It's a really good question. And to be really, really honest with you, I don't think I always know. And I don't think there's a simple answer to know if something's worth wanting. I think, though, that there are a couple of things we can test. So from the research, we do know that certain things are likely to make us happier than others. There's sort of a way of thinking about what makes you happy in life. And people talk about there being sort of two tracks to happiness. There's hedonism, so finding things that make you feel good. It can be a track to happiness. And there's another philosophy, which I believe is called eudaimonism. I might be pronouncing that incorrectly, but it's basically this idea of, living a good life, living a life in line with your values.
Yeah, eudaimonic happiness. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And people tend to say that, the research suggests that pursuing hedonism makes you happy in the moment, but probably doesn't drive well-being long-term. Eudaimonism is a much better driver of long-term happiness, fulfillment, and feeling worthwhile. So I would say that is one thing. I also think one of the things that I've been working on a lot for myself is questioning the stories that I tell myself about what will make me happy. And I think self-worth is actually really tied up in that. This idea of if I can achieve these external things that are not really about me, but are about how people see me. That used to be for a really long time a story I would tell myself about that giving me worth and therefore giving me happiness. And I've realized that actually those things give me neither. I feel like self-worth doesn't necessarily come from that, and nor does long-term happiness, really.
Yeah, for sure. Because you said a little bit earlier on that you said that as humans, we sort of, what is it that why do we go for things? Why is it that makes us feel? So a lot of the time, it makes us feel validated, almost, is in a manner of speaking, and instead of actually looking for the things that we really, really want to try and achieve, and it's an interest. This whole worth thing is a topic that I think we need to dig into a heck of a lot more, because the world is very much addicted to hedonistic happiness, and it's weird because when we try and relate success to happiness, it's almost like we have been misinformed, or we've gone down the wrong path in thinking that success is a eudaimonic happiness, it's a long-term happiness, when it's a hedonistic one disguised as, in many respects, right? Because success is something that we're projecting into the future as to what we want to achieve, right? And therefore we think that translates as eudaimonic because it's in the future. Whereas hedonistic is right now, in the moment, dopamine hit, happy days until the rush is over, and then you're after the next one, which is why it's addictive. But why do you think, and this is where it comes back to a more grand sort of question around defining success, because is success that incremental, achieving something, climbing that mountain, right? And doing it that way. Or, and it kind of ties in with my questioning of satisfaction, because can you, if you're wanting true success, success in a eudaimonic way, could you ever deduce if you were successful until the final whistle on your life is about to blow? Because while you've always got time, there's always time for that to change. And it kind of relates to a satisfaction question that I've had for a few years, when it was around my old man, when he was on his way out, and I've always had this problem with chasing satisfaction. Like, I never feel satisfied. You get there, it's that Alan Watts thing, right? By the time you get there, it becomes here, so therefore does there even exist?
Yeah.
From a behavioral science, from a neuroscience point of view, can we unpack this a little bit? And because I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on this whole success being hedonistic in disguise.
We can absolutely. I'll be really honest with you. I don't think I know all of the neuroscience behind that feeling of satisfaction. I was working in an addiction laboratory, so I did feel like we did study a lot of, say, the pleasure signals, the dopamine in certain regions of the brain, things like that, which we do tend to think of as hedonic, as things that give you pleasure in the moment. In terms of sort of that broader ability to sit back and look at your life and reflect on satisfaction, I actually don't know if I can fully talk to the neuroscience behind that. I think that it's incredibly complex, and I think if I was making claims about it, they would be a little bit empty. So I'm sorry, have we frozen? I feel like I'm
No. You just got me hooked.
just making sure.
Sorry, gang. I'm like listening, like I'm like full sucked into every word that Emily's saying. And bless her, I didn't move. I forgot to move. So that's sorry. Apologies for that. I'll try and maintain a little bit of movement as you gas on. Yeah, for sure. My apologies.
It's all good. But I do think I think that idea of like, can you know if your life has been successful until the very end? I mean, I think it depends on some of the goals you set for yourself. Like I think that sometimes, success isn't just a feeling of satisfaction. And I think the things that truly make you happy and feel successful do make you satisfied. But there's also, you can look at objective measures of success and, how many people have you helped, or what have you achieved, and, how have you set up the world to be a better place in it. And so I sometimes think that can be divorced from the feeling of satisfaction. The other thing that I've been sort of wrestling with, this is absolutely not a neuroscience thing, this is just an in Emily's head thing right now, is I feel like we have so many narratives in society that tell us what we should want. And sometimes I think we need to learn to question those narratives and those beliefs and be really honest about with ourselves about what we actually want and what will actually make us happy. To give you an example, I worked for a little while at a company that really had hustle culture. And so everyone was like, so, one of the things was, like, work will give you all your purpose and all your meaning, and you'll just achieve so much through it. And, we want to work 60 hours a week because it'll make us happy. We'll know we've been fulfilled by that. And I really bought into it. It was when I was a lot younger, working there. And then but even then I was like, I don't think I do want to work 60 hours a week. I don't think that's what will make me happy. But you're so often surrounded by people, no one's questioning it, and people are saying, this is what makes you happy, and actually having to question it. So I think that there's an element of needing to really question what people around us tell us we should want and be comfortable with what we actually do want as well.
Now, that's an interesting point to talk about, because having done a stack of research for the book, right, it's become very, very clear that for Gen Zs especially, that need to be part of something greater is incredibly prevalent. And I feel, and I've started to try and articulate this in various forums, that as a result of that need to be part of a collective, which is why you see so many of these people protest about stuff that they don't know a heck of a lot about and all this sort of jazz, right? But they're doing it because they think it's the right thing to do based on the popular opinion sort of thing. I feel that as a result of that, it's creating a crisis of identity for the individual, because they sort of mask their lack of understanding of their own identity with with the protester suit on, or the suit of armor that is a very superficial thing, but it's been brought about by that popular belief, so therefore I need to attach my flag to that mast sort of thing. Identity is becoming a huge issue, and I'm finding that, or observing that, identity is becoming so extreme, because for those people that are so hell-bent on being an identity, not like, I'm not talking popularist sort of celebrity identity, but just owning an identity that is theirs, I'm finding that they are being pushed further and further and further to an extreme, which is why you are seeing greater extremes of various different things, right? Talk to me about identity. Have you done much work on identity? Because this is something that I think needs to be tackled massively, because otherwise we're in deep shit. Because without identity, how can we have leaders that help people and help the collective reach a better place?
Yeah, 100%. I have done some work on identity. To just build on what you said before I share some thinking about that. I think one of the really interesting things that we know from the research is that people are lonelier than they have ever been. And so there is this element of being really connected through social media, through devices. But what the research tells us is that that connection doesn't feel as real or as good. And so I would argue probably doesn't feel as safe either, which talks to your point about this need to assume a mantle, or to assume a thing, like to assume a more extreme position. I think that we also know that social media tends to amplify things that engage us, and that tends to be things that make us angry. We like to doom scroll. We like to see things. Our attention is instantly drawn to that stuff, which also means it's a higher risk space, right? Because if you're being yourself and people are attracted to things that make them angry, you end up in a space where you might become the victim of that, or you might become incredibly afraid because you see other people becoming the victim of that, which again drives, a performative identity rather than an actual identity. Like, I think that's a really big problem that we need to address and think about the way that social media changes our behavior. I also think that, just in general, this is again just a thought that I have. I think we can become really addicted to the feeling of anger. People often say that anger is not a very positive emotion, but I would say it's often an emotion that feels good, particularly if we're feeling powerless, if we're feeling scared, if we're feeling vulnerable. A really nice replacement feeling for those feelings is anger. And so I think we need to sort of, when we think about how people might become performative, how identity might become either a protective barrier that people wear or a mantle that people take up where people feel a need to be inauthentic, we really need to grapple with the way that we as society are becoming angrier, more judgmental, and lonelier and less connected as well. So just to build on that, to the point about identity, I would say that I think there is also with identity, there are sort of stories that we tell ourselves about the sort of person that we are. What the research would suggest is a lot of those stories are formed very, very early and from very formative experiences that we go through. They can be really helpful stories. They can be very unhelpful stories. But one thing that we know is that often when people use identity language to describe themselves, it can be harder to disconnect from behaviors or things that are associated with that identity, even when those behaviors don't serve you very well. So if you say to someone like, I'm just a compulsive shopper, I'm a shopaholic, that when you use identity language, it can be used to really justify, okay, so I'm going to overspend on my credit card. I'm going to not regulate myself at the shops. Whereas if you say, I'm someone who has spent impulsively in the past, so it's not an identity statement anymore, it's a descriptive statement of your behavior, people tend to be more able to change and adapt their behavior to something that works better for them. So I think we just need to be careful about assuming identities that actually don't serve us, because they can almost become self-fulfilling prophecies.
That's a very, very interesting topic of conversation. Interestingly, I'll give you the example that talks to this really, really well and quite poignantly. So I was in a forum, an open forum where everybody had a chance to say their piece and whatnot, and it was this particular topic that we were talking about at the time was around mental health and dependency on substance abuse and all that sort of stuff. And the question was posed from someone, how can we help? It was a real estate based forum. So how can we help the real estate space and people within the real estate space to either get away from or avoid some sort of dependency on a substance? As with a lot of elements of society, there's a section of real estate where there are some people that are addicted to things because long work hours, high stress, all that sort of stuff. It's a perfect recipe for that, unfortunately. Now, it was interesting because some people, so the question was asked about dependency, but then the next question was, all right, but who looks after the leaders? Because it was asked of the leaders, right? So who looks after the leaders? And two of them, within 5 seconds, jokingly said either bottom of a bowl, or as a joke, said bottom of a bottle, or my husband goes and gets me a big glass of wine.
Yeah.
And what you just said there, what you just identified there in terms of identity language, even when we're joking, we don't realize the subconscious cement, shall we say, it is pouring into our identities in terms of what we're willing to accept or not accept as behavior, right?
Yeah.
Interest in this identity language piece, because, and I think that you can relate it to even little things. Like, I have a propensity to call myself a dickhead at various stages if I do something wrong, or I kick a table, or something clumsy or cumbersome, which is what my mates will have a right good laugh about, because that's what I was known for back in the day, as being a clumsy bleeder. And we don't realize that even those little things, those little sort of one-liners to ourselves, or muttering under your breath or whatever, we don't realize how much of an effect they have, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think when you use identity language, you're saying something about yourself, fundamental, and that can have a whole bunch of impacts, right? Because if it's something that's integral to you, it feels like it's something that can't change. So it reinforces a belief that this is who you are. This is not something that is adaptable. This is not something that you can evolve yourself from. This is, I am this. And we also know, and you've probably come across Brene Brown's work, for example, in the space around shame, that it can be incredibly psychologically damaging, right? To have identities that are negative about yourself as well. So, I am a bad person is a really different statement to I am a person who has done a bad thing, and even if it's said jokingly, even if it's said in jest, often that can be a reflection of how we really see ourselves or our reality, and it can be reinforcing those beliefs.
How can we rewire ourselves around that, though, right? Because obviously, I'm sure lots of people would have heard about things like affirmations and look at yourself in the mirror and say, I'm a great guy, and all this sort of jazz, right? But personal experience on that suggests that it feels so tremendously inauthentic and manufactured that you struggle to believe it. Let's put it this way. And a lot of the time, the solution for that by experts or gurus or whatever you want to call them in this space is repetition, and just keep saying it until eventually one day you'll believe it, sort of thing. I don't know if that's a valid and reasonable thing to ask of people when generally speaking, this whole identity thing is probably, I would argue that it's possibly the biggest challenge for a human being, is to understand, be able to articulate and own one's own identity and own it fully. So it doesn't matter where you are, who you're with, what you're about, being able to be fully who you are in every space is insanely difficult. Insanely difficult. So this whole affirmation thing, I'm sure it's got some degree of relevance to it. I suppose you can just, convince yourself, I guess. But how can we even take those first steps? Because for a lot of people, and especially, no, actually, no, I won't say especially, guys. For a lot of human beings, full stop, that have any level of conscious, of who they are and what they're about, it'll feel really weird doing this whole affirmation carry on.
Yeah. So, full disclosure, I haven't read a huge amount of research about affirmations, but I am a little bit skeptical of them, which could be of totally unfounded skepticism, because I feel like if you don't truly believe it and you look in a mirror and you go, I'm a great person, my intuition is that the next little thought that comes into your brain is, no, I'm not.
Yeah.
So how much does that actually reinforce the unhelpful belief that you're engaging in? Because just saying something that as out loud doesn't necessarily change the core belief that sits under there. And so I think what we do know does work from the research is distancing ourselves from our thoughts. So recognizing, our thoughts are not necessarily true, and they're not necessarily serving us, nor are they a reflection of reality. And so one of the things you can do, and I'm sure you do this yourself when you practice mindfulness, is actually just disconnect yourself. So when you have that thought, oh, I'm a bad person, you sit back and go, I'm having a thought that I'm a bad person. And even I find, and I can only speak from personal experience, but I really do feel like when I do that, my anxiety levels completely change, because as soon as I can disconnect myself and just say, I'm just having a thought that I'm a bad person, that instantly removes me from the emotion to an extent of that thought. And I think catching yourself in the moment and doing it is probably, because then actually what you're doing is you're not going, I'm a good person. No, I'm not. You're going, I'm a bad person. Actually, I'm just having a thought that I'm a bad person. So you're actually, every time you have the negative thought, you're then addressing it in the moment. And we do know from the research that that ability to disconnect ourselves through language and through our thoughts is a good way of addressing some of those challenges. Not the only, the panacea, but it is a really important part of it.
Okay, so essentially, and this is something that that Dom and I spoke about to a degree, was essentially understanding that when life is happening around us, it's not happening within us, right? And then our identity is a DNA thing, whereas anything that goes on, whereas behaviors, so identity is DNA, whereas behaviors are outside of us, right? They are as a result of a series of actions or things that have gone on. Now, and you talk about research delivering some suggestions that being able to disconnect thought from existence, shall we say, is really is something that can work. What happens though when you are caught up in so for example, take a breakup, for example, right? Someone goes through a breakup, and invariably the first thought is what they've done, but then you spend a strong amount of time thinking about what you've done, right? And how you could have changed things and all that sort of stuff. And a lot of the time it makes you feel a lot worse, right? When you start to go down that track of maybe it was all my fault and all that sort of jazz. How, for those people that really struggle with this sort of stuff, what are one or two things that you could suggest? Because it's, for me, I've talked about potentially the process, or trying to sort of articulate it in a way of slowing the situation down just long enough to give yourself a moment to breathe and create that degree of separation, right? what are your thoughts and suggestions based on research and conclusions that you've drawn as to how we can improve on that ability?
It's a really interesting question. I think the first thing is accepting that questioning process is really normal. From an evolutionary point of view, one of the things that makes humans so successful is that we have an ability to look back on things that have happened before, to go, why did they happen this way? And to therefore change our behavior in the future. Like, I think, for example, grief is such an unpleasant emotion that you feel. But often if something goes wrong and you're grieving it, what you're doing is you're playing it over in your head. The emotion is a motivator for us to actually re-engage with it, not forget the lessons that we've learned, replay things and say, if I had my time again, I would do it differently. That's actually an incredibly powerful tool that we have at our disposal. And it's something that's hugely, hugely useful for us because it means that we can grow and learn and adapt and change, and the decisions that we make today are not the same as the decisions we would have made 10 years ago. So I think one thing is accept it. This is part of a process that we're going through to help us learn and grow and transform and become more effective as human beings. I would say the challenge becomes, and I really find this with myself a lot of the time as well, we often assume that, A, we can become incredibly fixated on it, so we can ruminate on these things in a way that's no longer productive or helpful. But the second thing that happens is we can often have a narrative of how much control we had over a situation that actually isn't the case at all. I think we talked about this on the last time we chatted, but people have done an experiment where they put someone in a room and they have a light that goes on and off at random. And they tell people, see what you can do to make the light go on and off. And people will sit and they'll have some buttons in front of them. They'll press the buttons. Eventually, researchers will come back in and they'll say to people, how did you make the light go on and off? And they were like, yep, I figured it out. I can totally make the light go on and off. What I have to do is I have to press this button 3 times. Then I have to stand up in my chair. I have to spin around. And then I need to sit down again and I press this other button over here. Basically, we're storytelling machines that like to tell ourselves stories about how we're in control of our environment. What they're really doing is hallucinating a cause and effect that is not actually there. And I think that can be really important for us to understand because that serves an evolutionary purpose, right? If we believe that we're in control of our outcomes, we will take actions to change those outcomes. And in fact, there's a whole bunch of self-efficacy research that tells us how powerful that can be and how horrible it can be if we don't believe we're in control of our outcomes. But at the same time, that narrative can stop serving us when we start to obsess about what did I do wrong? How could I have done it better? How could the outcome have been different? And sometimes we just need to accept it couldn't have been. There were things out of our control. There were things that we weren't actually able to change. And so the big trick is obviously figuring out how to get to what can I learn from this and take something from it, and how can I accept that things that were out of control. That's a bit harder, but I think recognizing what's going on inside your head when those things are happening is a really important first step to do that. And to really ask, question, was I actually in control? Was there actually anything I could have done differently? And would it have changed the outcome if I did?
I'm going to get a little bit out there with my next question based off something that you mentioned. Well, something that you just said just then. Is it ever possible, right, for a human being to see the actual reality of a situation? Because you talked about how the whole 3 buttons, get up, spin around, and it was the humans that were hallucinating, i.e., they were painting a picture of what their world was like based on their whatever's going on in their head, their heart, and all that sort of stuff, and then they projected what the answer was onto the situation, right? Do you think it's ever possible for people to see reality for what reality actually is? Or, to go one step further and make this really fucking head spinning, does actual reality even exist?
These are head-spinning questions.
That's massive, isn't it?
Yeah.
Far out. I wasn't expecting that one. I don't know where I got. I accidentally put something in my coffee or something today. I'm not sure. Anyway, what do you reckon? Does he really exist?
So I'll answer the first one first because I feel like that's easier. Can we actually see reality? But then we'll handle the big one after that. So can we see reality as it actually is? I think, we have to, if you put the answer is probably no. And you can see that because the human brain only has limited abilities to see and understand what's going on around it. And by the way, also incredibly limited ability to see what's going on inside of it as well. There's a great book I really recommend to everyone called Incognito by the neuroscientist David Eagleman, who talks a lot about the way that our perception of reality is not actually real or is not as we see it, as we think we see it. That's not just, how we interpret things, but literally how we see the world. So to give a really, really simple example from that book, we have an illusion that we see the world visually like the way a camera takes a photo. So everything is in equal focus everywhere around us. What we actually know is that's not the case at all. And you can actually do this by, if you look ahead at a point in the room and then look at what else is around you, what you'll quickly notice is that there's something in front of you that's very much in focus, and just about everything in your peripheral vision is incredibly out of focus, and you actually are not seeing it clearly at all. The reason that we don't actually experience reality that way is as soon as we're interested in something happening over there, our head turns or our eyes move, and then we see it in focus. So we believe that we see the world through like a camera perfect thing. We're actually seeing it through like focus here and then blurriness all the way around. So we don't even see the world visually exactly as reality is. Our brains get very, very good at stitching together a version of reality that is very consistent, but that's an illusion that we're seeing it in the moment in that way, which is often why our memory lies to us, right? Because we're also, what our brain's also really good at is filling in all the blanks. I know that there's a chair somewhere over there, so I'm thinking about it and I can see like that there's a chair, but I've forgotten what color it is. So my brain is telling me a different color, for example. So even at the most fundamental level, we don't see reality fully as it is. Can we see reality more effectively? I think sometimes. I'm sure you've talked about this with Dom, but and we talked about this actually at the event we were at together. I really believe that we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. So we also apply that stitching together across a whole bunch of different things. We tell ourselves stories all the time about why things happen, what role we had in it, what's happening around us. I think there are methodologies you can use to get a clearer or more objective view of reality. Like, I don't believe that there is no such thing as truth. I think we can, look at evidence and we can apply a scientific method and we can test our thinking and we can validate things that can give us a clearer sense of that stuff. Then to your final question, is reality even real? Does reality exist? I think we can't answer that, right? Like, we don't know if we're in a computer simulation of the Matrix or if we're a brain in a jar that's just having sensory things put into us. But I think it's a really useful hallucination to have, or a really useful belief that we have. And I think the things that, this is now just me reflecting on me. I'm rambling at you because this is a really interesting.
No, I love it.
But genuinely, I think the things that tend to make me the happiest is when thinking about the world outside of myself. So for me, it's just, at least it's useful to believe it's there. Even, when you're thinking about like what gives me purpose, it's thinking about other people and their experiences and how we could make them better. That genuinely makes me happy. When I have a couple of years ago, like I was having a moment of, well, we're all going to die and the world is going to, like, the world as I know it is going to end. And thinking about the world going on without me was a really comforting thought, So I guess my short answer is it might not be real, but I choose to believe it. And I feel like that helps me.
The reason why I ask is because it sort of relates to my previous question around how can we help ourselves to separate the reality from the perception, right? The emotion from the event, right? Or the emotion from our identity. Could we argue that, and you kind of sort of alluded to it a little bit then with that last little comment, can we argue that by accepting that there is no such thing as reality, only our perception of it and our projection of it, can that not be the answer to a lot of people's problems when it comes to understanding situations in a holistic sense, right? And the reason why I say that is because a lot of the time when we get into arguments with people is because what we believe is reality is different to what someone else believes is reality, right? And the actual reality is likely to be somewhere in the middle, right? Realistically speaking.
Mm.
If we as humans were to become better educated around the just that one fact that we only see a perception of what reality is, it's only our perception that is unique to us, then therefore, just in the knowledge of that, it actually would help us to compartmentalize our emotion on a situation from the situation as it stands between two perceptions, because the situation is therefore it's not of us, and therefore that emotional piece is our projection on the situation. If we were to, you know what I mean? I know it sounds a little bit sort of roundabout way of saying something similar to what you said, but I just think that if we as humans can really accept that reality doesn't exist, and therefore the emotions that we're feeling are not real, they are just a temporary interpretation of that information, then just the actual imagery, the physical imagery of having reality not be there could actually help a lot of people to stay a bit more calm in particularly tricky situations, right?
Really interesting. I really like that. I think I'm a yes and a no. I love that. So I'll tell you where I'm a yes and then I'll tell you where I'm a no. So I think I'm a yes because I think the ability to understand that our experience is not objective reality is really important, right? It gives us humility. It allows us to question our assumptions and our beliefs, which, as you say, in an argument going, I accept that maybe I'm not completely right in this situation, or my understanding of the world is not necessarily a true understanding of the world. It's really, really important. It's important because it helps us to identify things that don't serve us. It helps us to question our worldview and to grow and to learn. So I think on the yes, I 100% agree. And I think the articulation that my experience is not objective reality is really important for us to understand. And as we were saying before about, helpful and unhelpful thoughts, right? Just because I have a thought that the world is the way it is, the thought's not reality. Just because I think I'm a bad person doesn't mean I'm a bad person. Just because I think everyone's out to get me doesn't mean everyone's out to get me, whatever those unhelpful thoughts might be. So I 100% agree. I think the ability to accept that our subjective experience is not objective reality, I think is critical and is such a thing that really serves us. I think the no part of my answer is I think it can get a little bit harmful or not helpful when you start to have a series of beliefs that everything is just our perceptions and our emotions, we should just get away from our emotions. They're just how we feel. They're not the reality. Because in some ways, I think it can give license to not be empathetic or to hurt other people. My reality is blind. If your reality is different, I'm sorry about that. Or if your reality is that I hurt your feelings, that's not on me. I'm not responsible for that. I think that can actually sometimes drive people to abrogate responsibility for the impact that they have on things that are not their immediate direct reality. And I see this a lot, that when people are like, oh, well, there's no such thing as, I have my truth, you have your truth. And people can use it as a way to actually not engage properly with people or the impact that they've had. So I think it's a helpful thought and it's a helpful provocation for us to question ourselves, our beliefs, our assumptions. But I think if we go too far, we can actually just disconnect ourselves from consequence. And that's a bit of a problem.
I agree.
Just before you jump in, I just wrote this down because I was like, oh, I want to talk about this. You talked about compartmentalization of emotion. I think one of the things that's super interesting from the research is actually that emotion is an incredibly powerful tool to help us to make effective decisions. Emotion can lead us astray, but it can also lead us down the right path. And again, I think we might have talked about this last time we chatted, but there's an experimental design called the Iowa gambling task that people use. And what it is you're pulling from different cards that have a chance of being a positive outcome or a negative outcome. There are high risk, high reward cards, and there are low risk, low reward decks. What tends to happen is if you measure people's skin conductivity, which is a measure of their emotion, what you find is that when people start to pull from decks that are not very rewarding, that actually are overall have negative outcomes overall, their skin conductivity goes up way before they stop pulling from that deck. There's a subconscious part of their brain that recognizes that this is a risky or a bad decision. Then if you ask them, how do you feel about the decks? They say, I don't know yet. Then they'll stop pulling from the deck, and then they'll start to articulate, oh, I think that was a bad deck. So in that case, their subconscious brain was sending them emotional signals that it had actually figured out the correct, in commas, approach way before their rational brain did. And actually what we find is that most of the times when we rationalize things, they're really just us giving a rational explanation for something that our emotions are driving us towards anyway. So I would say I do agree with not letting emotions override you and not assuming that your emotions are reality, but we also know that emotions can be really valuable inputs into decision making as well.
Oh, 100%. I know for a fact that whenever I get angry, it's like whenever I get angry, I tend to operate like incredibly well. It's weird. I tend to operate insanely well. If someone irritates me, it sends me into a different level from an intellect, like from a brain power point of view and whatnot, and it gives me that drive to prove someone wrong, which, with respect to self-doubt around, you can't do this, you could never complete that, that's not for you. And I'll go, right, well, fuck you. I'm going to make sure it happens, right? Just to prove you wrong. What I was sort of alluding to, though, with regards to that reality piece, is I'm sort of thinking that instead of saying that reality, we have our own reality, my argument with this is the fact that if we were to suggest that reality doesn't exist, therefore no one owns reality. There is no such thing as a personal reality. You know how you said my truth, your truth? This is my reality, this is your reality, which does end up creating arseholes for sure, 100%. If we were to put it into plain English for a sec, it does create arseholes. But if we as a society were to accept that there is no such thing as an ownership of reality, right? Reality is in the middle of the game, right? Reality is in the middle of the field, and we're all around it looking at it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So therefore, the objectification of reality as a thing that none of us have in our ownership would therefore potentially help us to go, right, okay, well, I'm looking at reality from this way, but they're looking at reality from a different angle. Then therefore, because none of us own reality or own our own reality, we just have that perception based on where we're standing on the field of play, that is life.
I love that. And so maybe I need to see if I can get as close as possible to where they're standing so I can see as close as possible what they're seeing in that reality.
Exactly.
I love that. Actually, I 100% agree with that. I think that's awesome.
I quite like that notion.
Yeah.
That none of us own reality.
Yeah. We're all just looking at it from our own angle.
Yeah. And for me, because I think a lot of the time, a lot of people struggle with these conversations because they really struggle to be able to project it, right? They really struggle to be able to actually objectify it and, make it feel tangible and whatnot. And I think that's something that I'm really glad that we've had a bit of a yarn about. And it's been interesting because we've sort of weaved in and out of our last conversation a little bit. And I think that this is a wonderful thing to have stumbled on, that none of us own reality. And if you can accept that, then it's a lot easier for you to be able to not just reason and forego your own emotions and to not allow yourself to be angry about certain things and whatnot. I think that's wrong. And I actually agree with you. Emotion is a critical thing of being a human being, right? It's the thing that makes us human.
Yeah.
But to accept that none of us own this thing that is life.
Yeah.
It's making me, as I'm saying, as I'm thinking, it was making me feel a little bit calm.
Yeah, I'm the same. And I think it's also making me feel really curious as well. You sometimes hear people talking, you're like, oh, don't want to listen to you anymore. Now I'm like, I want to go stand over where you're standing and look at reality from your,
You know what I mean?
I'm curious at what people are seeing. So I think anything that prompts curiosity, I really love.
That's quite cool. That's quite cool. Now, I want to dig into your vast array of intellect and ask you a bit of practical stuff around high performance when it comes to brain patterns and brain and behaviors and all that sort of stuff. Right now, I've got your definition as knowing what they want, clarity, basically clarity, knowledge, and again, and it relates to the emotion, right? If it's in order for it to feel worthwhile, it's got to feel worthwhile. That's the feely bit, right? That's the bit, what is it though within high performance individuals that you've seen along your trip of observing countless thousands of humans across your studies and research and whatnot? What do you think have been some real key behavioral traits, right? And I ask you with a little asterisk, which says underneath, without trying to sound too cliche about it.
Yeah. Oh, okay. That's interesting. Yeah. What? Okay. I think one thing. Oh, there's lots. Okay. I think one thing. You tell me if this is cliche. Actually, that high performance people from the research that suggests that they tend to be more effective is that they have a high level of self-awareness about what they are truly capable of. And that also includes a really strong ability to forgive themselves if they don't hit some impossible standard. So there's some research, for example, into, I'm going to give you a few different things that's formulating this thought in my head as I'm speaking out loud at you. So, for example, there's research that looks at why do people procrastinate. There's a ton of different reasons that people procrastinate. But one of the things that people believe drive procrastination is actually a fear that if I really try and I don't succeed, it's worse than not trying at all. Right. So if I say, well, I didn't do really well on the test because I didn't study for it, that's a more protective thing than going, I tried really hard and I still failed the test. And so I think one of it is, sorry, I'm kind of rambling because I'm putting this together.
No, I'm moving it.
So I think it's, it's that thing of like not having an honesty about your behavior and so and let me keep going actually before I sum up that point, because I feel like there's more to it than that. The second thing is we know that everyone in the world has failures of self-control. We know that when you set yourself targets, when you set yourself goals, people become impulsive, people become stressed. There are a whole bunch of different things that can reduce our ability to exercise self-control, and we'll often have failures around that. There are two things that really successful people do. The first thing they do is they forgive themselves when they have a failure of self-control. We know, for example, that when people set budgets for themselves, on average, people who set a budget and then break the budget spend more money than if you didn't have a budget at all. Because you have a thing called what the hell thinking. Oh, well, it's done now. It's completely broken. My perfect view of reality is stopped, so therefore I'm not going to try at all. I'm going to go overcorrect the other way. Whereas if you have, if you forgive yourself, you go, I broke the budget, but I'm just going to keep sticking to the budget. I'm going to try again and keep going with it. The other thing people do when they're really successful is they set themselves what are called Odyssean contracts, where you go, I know I'm going to have failures of self-control, but I'm going to put things in place so that I can't fail. Or if I fail, there's something external to me that's going to force me to keep going. So that comes from the Greek myth of Odysseus, where he knows that he's going to, he really wants to hear sirens, but he knows that sirens, when they sing, you steer your ship. So what he does is gets his whole crew to stop up their ears and he tie him to the mast. So he can't sail the ship. So you basically go, I know my self-control is going to fail, but I'm going to put things in place that are a guardrail. So when it does fail, I'm okay. So I think in all of those cases, what you have is people who are really comfortable with the fact that they might fail. So I'm not going to procrastinate because I'm okay with trying and not getting there. The failure is okay. I'm okay. I recognize that when my self-control fails, I'm not going to overspend and do what the hell thinking. I'm going to I'm going to get back on the horse. I'm going to go back. I'm going to recover my behavior. I also know that I am likely to fail. I know that there are traps that I'm going to fall into. So I'm going to put things around me that help me to make sure that when those failures of self-control come in, when those common mistakes that get made, there are guardrails that mean that the failure is not going to be particularly devastating. I'm going to stay on track. So I think that what all of those things do is it's a recognition of your own vulnerability. It's a self-awareness and it's an understanding and acceptance of failure while still giving yourself the guardrails to fail effectively. I feel like that's a really long, convoluted answer. I hope that makes sense.
No, it wasn't.
My brain went.
No, it wasn't. No, I was more than happy tootling along behind your brain then. I was more than content having a little wander behind that. That's incredible. It's really, really good. I love the way that you've articulated that because I think the cliched versions of those are, fall down seven times, get up 8 sort of thing, right? That's the cliche commoditized version of what you just said there. But what I think is fantastic, which is not articulated, is this concept of an Odyssean contract. That is something that I think the world needs to know a lot more about, because I think one of the things that really, like you said, it's not the fact that you can be bothered or not. It's the fact that if you try really hard and it doesn't go right, then what does that mean, sort of thing, right? Where am I then? You could also relate that to people that you said forgiveness is a huge part of it, but for people that are at a starting gate and they're looking out and sort of combining the two, and even forgiving yourself that I might not get to the end of the course, but I'll get further than where I was when I started.
Yeah.
And accepting that piece, I think, is really, really important. I want to ask you though.
Oh, sorry. Just to build on what you said, I think your lines, we were talking about your book before we started recording, and you were talking about the fact that so many things are just keep trying. It'll and acting though it's easy. And I think there's a thing of going, I accept that it's not always going to be easy. I accept that there's going to be struggle. I accept that there's going to be setbacks, and that's okay. And just acknowledging that. And I think when we acknowledge that, then it gives us that motivation to stay on the journey, as opposed to, oh, everyone else made it sound really easy and I'm finding it really hard. Therefore, I'm going to stop here. And yeah.
I've got two things that we need to talk about now. The first one, just on that one, I mean, it's been weird, right? Whenever everyone's asked me or would, ask me about the book and whatever, and my first reaction whenever anyone's asked me is, it was a massive pain in the ass. It was the hardest thing I've done, massive pain in the ass. And it's been making everybody laugh, right? And I've been going like, it's not that funny. It was really fucking hard. I wasn't a joke. That was me selling.
I was opening my soul.
I was actually, I fucking cried several times trying to write that fucking thing. Right? But I think the reason why people are laughing is because whenever you look at authors and all these really clever individuals that people should be following and all that sort of shit, they do give that air of Teflon, right? That nothing sticks and what have you, right? And I think the reason why people are laughing is because maybe no one's even really said something like that around this personal development book that's supposed to make everyone a bit more curious about success and actually help people to be successful. And I'm calling it the biggest pain in the ass I've ever had in my life. Yeah. Right. So I don't know whether I'm contradicting, whether it's the contradiction that makes it funny.
I think just to build on really quickly, because I know you've got more things to say, but I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Adam Fraser's work on grit. He's amazing. I really recommend everyone have a read of his stuff. But he does shares a whole lot of research and talks a lot about how struggle makes things worthwhile, and how often the things that we're most proud of, but also the things that give us the most satisfaction and that we feel the most joy from, are the things that that were the hardest to do and the hardest to achieve. We very rarely feel that level of satisfaction from things that are easy. In fact, he shares research that shows that in societies where things become too easy for people actually lose motivation, direction, and happiness, because the struggle is part of the joy, and the overcoming of that struggle is part of the joy. So maybe it's too close to writing the book for you to feel that yet, but
I'm not feeling it. I ain't feeling it. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not feeling it.
Anyway, I'm sure one day I will. Now, the other thing that I wanted to challenge you with is what you said there about self-awareness of one's abilities. And it brings into the crosshairs of the conversation the challenge between, or the fine line between, confidence and arrogance.
yeah.
So talk to that a little bit for me, because you could like the simple comment on that is arrogance is a false belief in one's abilities, i.e. their abilities aren't quite matching what their perception of their abilities are, right? But for a lot of people, and we're all human, we can all fall for it. When you get on a roll of success, or when you get on a roll of winning or being right or whatever it is, that long string of validation makes it very difficult to not start to become a little bit arrogant about certain things, right? So what are your thoughts on this line between confidence and arrogance?
I think it's a really tricky one. I love the saying, arrogance starts where ability stops. And so the key thing is, where does ability stop? And you say, when you get feedback and validation, it really builds the belief that your ability is ongoing. And maybe that's true. I think there's a few things. I think one thing is genuinely surrounding yourself with people who will give you honest, open feedback. I think it can be very, very easy. And I think there's an irony in that actually sometimes the less secure we truly feel, the more we want to surround ourselves with people who will tell us how good we are, or who will validate everything we have. And then that can create this sort of feeling of arrogance. But so I think finding the people around you who will tell you the hard truths and who will be really honest with you is a really good way of getting external validation of your actual ability and where you might have areas for improvement. And I'm a huge believer in that. I will tell everyone around me, I would rather you be honest and tell me how I can get better than just make me feel good. And I think the second part of that is obviously creating the space where people feel safe to give you that honest feedback as well, and to take it on board. I think that the second thing is, I think being curious and delving deeply into any area, I think is its own treatment against arrogance. I find inevitably in every facet of my life, the people who are the most experienced, the most knowledgeable, who have thought the most deeply about something, are often the most humble. And I think it comes from a few things. I think that when you delve deeply, the more you look into something, the more that you realize you don't really know. There's all these bits around the edges that you don't really know, or you don't understand, or that you're not really able to do. Where I think it's, when you do a 10-minute Google on something, you're like, oh, I totally understand that. Then you like read the articles that are underneath the 10-minute Google, and you're like, oh, it's actually well on. I understand. So I think like going deep helps you to combat that arrogance, because you actually get to see where your blind spots are. And I think going deep also gives you the confidence to step into the I don't know, or I haven't fully mastered it. Because when you have that confidence that I've done my work, I've done my research, I've practiced this skill over and over again, you can sit in that confidence to go, and I still have room to improve. And I always think when I was doing my PhD, there was a really interesting phenomenon where when different people would give presentations all the time, at the Brain and Mind Research Center or the School of Psychology. And the more junior a researcher, so the most junior were honor students and things like that, whenever you'd ask a question, they would, regardless of whether they knew the answer or not, they would confabulate till they could give you something that sounded plausible. And the more senior someone got, the more comfortable they were just going, that's a really good question. I have no idea what the answer is. And I think they could just sit in that comfort of that safety to say that I don't know. So.
Yeah. I think because you could relate arrogance back to this whole thing of reality, right? And how you could argue that it's arrogance that is the single thing that leads us into the most amount of trouble.
Yeah.
Around whether it's society, whether it's personal, whatever. You could argue that it is arrogance that is the fly in everybody's ointment, in a lot of ways. How do we, just with the stuff that you've just said then, say for example, and I think this would be quite useful for a lot of people that listen to this. Say for example, you've got someone that is inherently arrogant in your life, right? Whether it is at work, whether it is a family member, whatever. You've got someone that really does float on a cloud of gold that is just theirs and no one else's, right? Cloud of gold. I don't even think, anyway. So what would be your suggestion based on research and whatnot as to how we can help them to see the arrogance that they possess in a way that's not just going to cause a bus stop?
Yeah. Okay, I don't have the research. This is just what I reckon. I think it's hard. I think I have two thoughts on it. The first is I really do think there needs to be safety, because I sometimes think arrogance can be a defense mechanism, right? Like there are people who genuinely believe that they're the most amazing person in the world and they know everything and they can do everything. But a lot of times that's a really protective belief that someone's wrapped around them like a security blanket. Yeah. Because facing the reality that maybe I don't know, maybe I'm not in control, maybe I'm not as good as I say I am, is quite a dangerous thing for them, psychologically dangerous thing. So I think that creating safety, creating that feeling of like, I care about you as a person, not because of what you've achieved or what you're able to do. And so you're in a safe place where if you're not as good as you keep saying that you are, you'll still be accepted, you'll still be cared for. Probably I'll like you better than I like you now, whatever the case might be. I really think safety is the first step to getting people to let their guard down and admit the vulnerability. Because arrogance is not a vulnerable position. Saying I don't know or I'm not able or I can't is inherently vulnerable, right? So I think getting people to feel safe is a key thing. The second thing, and this is maybe a less helpful answer, is I think it's doing that in a way where you're not compromising your own well-being as well. And there might just be instances where as much as you want to, you can only really be responsible for yourself and your own ability to perspective take. And it can be hard to try and get others to take a different look at themselves without, as you say, blowing it up and stuff. So I think within the, this is something I've been working on, is not feeling responsible for trying to fix everything else about others or help others in a way that I can't or I'm not able to.
Yeah, and because it's that sort of relates to what you said about how you rock, what you do and what you've been focusing on for a while, which is which levers to pull. Do you pull a safe? You could turn it into that lever conversation. Do you need to pull a safety lever? Do you need to pull a slap around the face, metaphorically speaking, of course, lever, right? Is the truth the thing that they need to hear, or do they need to find the truth for themselves? And we just need to provide that space in order to help them find it.
Yeah.
Really I like that safety thing around arrogance, because you're right.
Yeah. And And, maybe one of the ways you create that safety is by modeling vulnerability and showing people that it's okay as well. One of the most powerful experiences, I don't know if Dom talked about this with you or not, but that I had was we had a leader at our work. We did Leadership Impact, which is like an LI tool, human statistics tool, that basically looked at 360-degree feedback of a leader and looked not at their behaviors specifically, but how their behaviors had an impact on others. And our CEO at the time took the test and was really, really confronted by the feedback that he got. What he found was not only that his impact was quite negative on a lot of people in the organization, but also that because you also do a thing where you're like, what do I think is the ideal qualities of a leader? His own like self-reflection was really non-ideal version of what I would like. And there are so many different reactions that you can have to that feedback. And what he actually did was he sat down and had the whole company in a circle around him and showed his results and said, this is what I've heard. I'd really like to hear from all of you. Please tell me like how I can do better and what I can do better. And just sat, and it was such a moving experience. And he made himself so vulnerable as people told him like directly to his face how his behavior had impacted them. And that was such a powerful act of leadership because we all saw how committed he was to having a better impact and to being a great leader for the company. But the secondary thing it did was it really normalized feedback conversations and people being able to say, I didn't do very well today as a leader. And so all of a sudden, the whole leadership team of the company had safety and security and actually like a cultural expectation that they would be vulnerable, that they would own their mistakes, that they would be open to hearing where they'd gone wrong. So maybe the creating the safety is also about modeling the vulnerability as well. And when you step and you're like, I'm not going to be arrogant, I'm going to tell you all the things where I could improve. Maybe that's a way to create that safety for other people to do it as well.
Yeah, true. I think that's a really, really good way of looking at it. And I think, as you were talking then, what a wonderful example of leadership.
Oh my gosh, it was amazing.
I mean, wow, to have the minerals to do that is, and the symbolism of basically being the one to throw themselves into the Colosseum in with the lions. That's hectic. That's really, really cool. And I'm sure, team, you're thinking about some leaders that you work with, or know about. And it's almost like a bit of a test. It's almost like a grade. Like, how likely are they to want to do that? Or how likely is this person? Or this person would never in a million years do,
Yeah.
right?
And talk about modeling your values as well. Like how many organizations say we value robust feedback and direct honesty? How many would have the bravery to do that? Worked for a different organization where they said we're going to do leadership feedback, but there was so much concern about the giving of that feedback that you could only select from a drop-down list of statements about the leader. You couldn't clearly write correct feedback to that person. And that was also a company that said that they really valued honesty and growth and feedback as well. So yeah, talk about like a true modeling of values and of leadership. I think it was amazing.
Look, we could go off on a whole other tangent around, the perception of value versus the reality of value, and how behaviors don't tend to correlate in a number of instances, especially when money's involved. But I've taken up so much of your time, and man, you know what? I might actually lie to you again and say that this one's knackered as well, so I can have another conversation with you.
Thank you. I love these conversations. You just let me ramble and you ask such good questions. It makes me really think hard about what I reckon about things.
No, I love it. Emily Heath, you are a gem of a human being. You're an absolute gem, and you are someone that the world needs to hear a lot more of. I truly believe that. I think your perception, where you're stood on the field of life, and looking at the reality for what you see it, it's a version of reality that I think a lot more people would be a lot healthier if they were to come and take a look. I really believe that. Thank you so much for your time. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. One last question, though. What is Emily Heath working on as she's heading towards the next version of high performance in her life?
Oh, good question. Do you mean working on personally or
Personally.
personally? I think the really big thing that I'm working on right now is around people pleasing. I have a real need, some would say pathological need, to make people around me really happy, and to give people what I think they want. And I think that often results in me not being truly honest with myself or with them. And I think, I also think the big thing that I've realized I do is I sometimes make myself small because I feel like people don't want to see someone who, it's the arrogance confidence thing, but I think I swing a little bit the other way. And so I'm really trying to step into who I am, be honest to who I am, and worry a little bit less about what people think as a result of that.
You and me both, Doc. You and me both, in a big way. And I'll tell you now, you've most certainly got a supporter in me. Now, I'll tell you that free and for nothing. So if you start doubting yourself, if someone starts, just give us a yell, and I'll come windmilling in. That's no problem at all. You've got a follower in me. So, and I'm sure, having listened to Emily, I'm sure you lot are absolutely going to become followers of her as well. I'm going to obviously be putting the links to her, as I do with all guests, in the show notes. You are mad to not follow this individual. She operates on a different level to most of us, but she operates with a level of humility that I'm sure she will never let go of, but I think she will learn to temper so that more of us can hear her more frequently. Emily Heath, what an absolute pleasure. I cannot thank you enough for your time on this little podcast of mine.
Thanks, Annie. Pleasure's all mine.
Team, stay safe, healthy, happy. As always, look after yourselves and each other. By the way, Emily, and just because I'm thinking of changing my little end bit, right? Because I've been listening, of all people, to Pat McAfee. Do you know who he is?
Vaguely, I'm not super familiar with him though.
Right. So he was a former NFL punter, right? So he's like one of the least important positions, one could argue, or, lots of people argue, when it comes to American football, right? But his personality saw him start a podcast that was then rejected by ESPN, mainstream media. He then went, fuck it, and then became bigger than ESPN to the point where ESPN had to buy him back.
No. Okay. It turns out I totally didn't know who he was. I think the name was familiar and I was projecting someone else in my mind because I never heard that story.
He focuses his entire life on sports, but the way that it's not just about the sport, and I am a sports freak, right? But it's not just about the sport. The way that he operates on his podcast it's just a world of positivity. And at the end of every podcast, and every episode, he goes, be a friend, tell a friend something nice. You don't know what they're going through.
I love that.
Or you don't know how much that might help. Be a friend, tell a friend something nice. How good is that?
I love that. I think that's awesome. And I really think the research would say that also makes you happier as well.
Oh, God. It's a purely selfish act if you look at it one way, right? Like, to be nice to someone makes you feel good. So fuck it. Just be nice more often, then you'll feel better.
Yeah. I love that. I think that's such a good prompt though, because it's so easy to forget that. So just as your listeners listen in and you hear,
Yeah, seriously. Anyway, so team, I know I've gone on a little bit of a tangent. Look after yourselves. Take care. We'll speak to you again soon.
And do something nice.
Do something nice. Say something nice to someone.